Thank you, Chandra, for doing that. So I like to begin on time, and I appreciate that, time is always of the essence. And since all of our four distinguished panelists have arrived, we're going to start, and others will join us as they're able. I am Lori Yadin. I'm a board member of the League of Women Voters of Delaware and the chair of the Criminal Justice Portfolio. And I, along with my team, Marjorie Green and Letty Diswood and Martha Gessler, are honored to welcome our amazing panelists, who I will introduce in just a minute, and to bring you this very important issue today. I feel honored to be serving as the moderator this afternoon for this League Day event, The Cost of Justice, Delaware's Fines and Fees System. It is our goal to not only inform and educate our membership and all who join us this day, it is our hope to inspire folks so that they are moved to act. And at the same time, we want to elevate the good work that each of our panelists is involved in to equally support the well-being of all citizens of this great state. The outline for the event today is I will be introducing the panelists one at a time. And once I present an introduction of a panelist, they will have a time to present and speak. Following a presentation, I will move on to the next panelist. We have 4 panelists today. After each of the panelists has had an opportunity to share, then we will open the floor for questions. The criminal justice portfolio had come up with a list of questions, which was shared with the panelists in advance. And we will also be monitoring chat. Once a few of the questions that were initially shared are asked and the panelists have an opportunity to respond, we will then open the floor to Marjorie, my colleague, who will ask the questions from the chat room. And yeah, that's how we will proceed. As we open today, I want to share a quote that always sticks with me, especially at moments like this, from a philosophy professor of mine that maybe you have heard of his name, Cornel West. And Professor West taught us to never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. And I think that's a really awesome, amazing quote that I want to uplift today as we tackle the issue before us. So our first speaker, Our first speaker is Hanif Salam. Mr. Hanif Salam is a native Delawarean born and raised in Wilmington. He is engaged in empowering the community and very passionate about helping individuals released from prison become positive and productive members of our community after making that change himself. Mr. Salam has worked with the government and nonprofit agencies focused on prisoner reentry for the past 10 years, holding positions such as president of the Delaware Reentry Consortium and community facilitator for IADAP, the governor's reentry initiative. He also started Building Success LLC, a small nonprofit that provides consultation and program planning for nonprofits. Prior to joining the ACLU of Delaware, Mr. Salam was an in-reach coordinator for the Hope Commission at the Achievement Center. Mr. Salam is passionate about helping disadvantaged populations find solutions and ways to overcome their barriers to success. In his free time, Mr. Salam is a community advocate in Wilmington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here today, Hanif.
Thank you, Lori. And I would like to thank the League of Women Voters for having this great event and inviting me to participate on this great panel. I would like to start off today just by publicly thanking Rep. Lynn for his work on HB 244 and ensuring that it was introduced and passed through the House. And I am hopeful that we will be successful in getting it through the Senate before the end of this legislative session. But fines and fees is an important topic and issue, and that's why I am excited about the steps that we are taking in eliminating, possibly one of the biggest challenges and hurdles people face that owe fines and fees, and that is the suspension of driver's license. That will be a major help. But today, I really just wanted to take time to help people understand how fines and fees are so detrimental to the average individual that it is afflicted upon. So in my opinion, you have two different categories of people who are most challenged by fines and fees. One is an individual who, in most times, have been convicted of criminal charges, right? And in those cases, an individual could either have been sentenced to prison, sentenced to probation, or just strictly sentenced to fines and fees. And to be clear, when we say fines and fees, we're not talking about restitution. We're not talking about the payment to an individual for property or physical damage. We are talking about either there is a fine in connection to the criminal act that you committed, and or there are fees and court costs involved in that. You know, I personally went through that, receiving a drug charge in 1999. And, unfortunately, after that charge, I was unsuccessful within the probation system, which caused a cycle of recidivism for myself and my life. But in 2003, once I was finally smart enough and strong enough to break out of that cycle, in which I haven't been back since 2003, by the way. One of the things that I found on my journey to success was that I owed the state thousands of dollars for fines and fees after already serving time in jail for these criminal acts and sometimes non-criminal with the violation of probations. Even after being on probation for over a 5-year period, despite all of that, even after turning my life around and being crime-free for years, I still had fines and fees, and I was unaware of this until 2012, when I decided to make the biggest difference for my community and run for city council, so that I could truly make a difference in the city of Wilmington. And once I got to, the voting, the Department of Elections, to get my name on the ballot, after paying the fee to run for city council, I was then contacted and told me that I'd be reimbursed what I paid because I was not qualified, because I owed $200 and some odd for court costs that were attached to my original charges from 1999. And the unfortunate thing about that in 2012 was, although it was only $200 and some odd and I could easily pay it, at that time, the law had stated, even if you paid all fines and fees, you had to wait a 5-year period before you would be eligible to vote or to run within an election in Delaware. And it just crushed my dreams of being an elected city official. But I did get peace back together. That very next year, that law was changed. So, you know, today, if I wanted to, I could, although I have no desire to run at this point. You know, and that's how it affected me personally. And I want to leave you with another story of a close friend of mine that finds that he's affected without his criminal background necessarily being in the way. And my friend, for the sake of this conversation, his name would be D. And D had stopped working his job as a cook to take care of his sick mother. And in doing so, during that period, his mother's sister, his aunt, passed away. So he then, after his mother, he got his mother together. She was feeling better. He then went and began to care for his little cousins. Some were adults, some were still in the teenage state after the passing of his aunt. During this transition of caregiving for D, he lost his ID. He didn't have a driver's license, he never drove, but he lost his ID. And he didn't have the money to be able to go to DMV and get another ID. So as he was brainstorming of chores, jobs he could do in the community to maybe make 15, 20 bucks to get a new ID, he just spent time doing what he loved, and that was riding his bike. So on one summer evening, D was pulled over by the cops and notified that he was riding his bike without the proper lighting. Apparently, if you're going to ride a bike in the evening, you have to have a light on the front that shines, and you have to have a reflector on the back that blinks. D did not have this lighting on his bike and received a $125 ticket for not having it, right? D doesn't have $125. He was just looking to try to make $20 in the community to get a new ID so that he could get a job and go back to his cooking profession. So D was unable to pay the $125. At months passed, D now has a capias for failure to pay. D still rides his bike. He's trying to live stress-free as much as he can, but he's really overwhelmed. He's like, they're gonna lock me up. I don't have $100 and some odd dollars to pay. All I want is an ID so that I can go to work. I can pay these fines and fees. I'll be all right. Unfortunately for D, it didn't work out that way. He then had police contact again and was taken to Howard R. Young Correctional Institute for failure to pay and failure to appear. D then had to sit at Howard R. Young for a period of 6 months. After 6 months, he finally went in front of a judge who, luckily for D, it doesn't always work out for people this way, the judge then threw out his fines and fees, let him home. Immediately when I seen D when he came home, we went straight to DMV. I gave him the necessary $15, $20. He now has an ID. And, you know, this was a few years back. Once D got his ID, he got a job at McDonald's. While working at McDonald's, he then obtained a job at Cook at Bahama Breeze, where he is still currently employed. So I just wanted to share those two stories about myself and my friend D, just so everybody can understand the cycle that fines and fees can put you in. Understanding that most times these courts costs and these fees are already being dedicated or purposed through to things and initiatives that are handled through the average taxpayer dollars. So is it really necessary to keep people in these debtor prisons? I think not. And I hope that the rest of Delaware and our Delaware legislator will continue to eliminate fines and fees in Delaware. Thank you.
Thank you, takes a lot of courage to share a personal story, and yet personal stories are important because I think that's how we connect with the human in each other. So I really appreciate you doing that. Our next speaker is Miriam Y. Dede. Miriam, after graduating from the University of Virginia, started her legal career at a law firm in Delaware practicing chancery litigation. After a few years in, she switched her career paths and now practices as a trial attorney in the state public defender's office. Outside of her job, Miriam also coordinates the Campaign to Debtors Prison, a community and advocacy group working to reform court fines and fees in Delaware. The campaign to end debtors' prisons seeks to end poverty as an element of criminal punishment. And I want to take, I was remiss, and I want to take the time for a minute to just thank the campaign to end debtors' prison and the ACLU to be our partners for today's presentation. And with that, I welcome you, Marion.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for putting this together and for all the support on these issues throughout the years it's been now. It's, you know, all of these things are always a team effort, and the League of Women Voters has been such a great ally in this fight for justice. I also want to echo Hanif's thanks to Representative Lynn, who's with us today. And I also want to add to that, who's not with us, but also a thanks in advance to Senator Brown, who's hopefully going to be pushing forward HB 244 in the Senate to get that bill finished, which really is going to make significant steps in starting to reform some of these systems that we're talking about today. So I, you know, and I'll say, Hanif, thank you so much for sharing those stories. It was stories like that, largely from talking with clients, that is what got me interested in this work, because I think it's just so obviously unfair to be giving people fines and fees in this system and keeping them down when there's so many people like you and like your friend Dee who are doing the right things and should be given those second chances and not burdened by debt like this. So I had some slides I was going to share. Let me see if I can do this. I think I can. There we go. That just kind of go over some of the numbers and stats of what we're talking about. And I'll tell you, a lot of this is taken from what I've personally seen. When I started as a public defender, I was in the Court of Common Pleas, which is one of our, it's one of the main misdemeanor courts. So everything in the Court of Common Pleas is misdemeanors. And these numbers and everything here really came from research that I did and the campaign did about what we were seeing folks in the community experiencing when it comes to fines and fees. So a run-of-the-mill misdemeanor in Delaware can cost over $500. And this is just an example of how that happens. For most misdemeanors, people are not serving jail time. For most of them, people are looking at low-level probation, a fine, and that's really it in terms of what the punishment is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a fine only, or a fine with low-level probation, or even no fine and just probation. And yet the way that our court system and our legislative system currently tax costs onto this, it becomes a much bigger impediment than it really is designed. And I'm using misdemeanors as an example here. Fines and fees affect felonies as well, but misdemeanors are what most of the court system is. So in Delaware, if someone was charged a $100 fine and they were put on low-level probation, a very typical sentence for any kind of misdemeanor charge, they get a $100 fine, and the purpose of that is supposed to be the deterrent or punishment. That's actually the aim of the criminal justice system, is the fine portion. The $402 in extra cost, the only purpose is to generate money for the state. It's actually not a part of the justice system. It's something that's been added onto it over the last 40, 50 years through legislative additions. Most of these fees, this rundown here, these are what the fees are actually called. And if you were convicted of something in the Court of Common Pleas, this is what you would be seeing. So just in this example, there's a $1 video phone fund fee, $1 intelligence fund, $15 fund to combat violent crimes, $10 volunteer ambulance company fund, $10 victims compensation fund, $100 public defender fee, $200 probation fee. Most of those go to funds that then pay for the services that they're named after. It's not true for all of them. The public defender fee, for example, is one that's targeted by that bill we've been mentioning. It would get rid of this. That actually doesn't go to the public defender's office. It just goes to the state's general fund. And a couple of the others here are in the same boat, where they're just money generators. It doesn't even go to the thing it's supposed to be paying for. But regardless, all of these aspects of the justice system that are covered by these fees are things that used to be covered through general taxes. And then in an effort to not raise income tax, these fees were created instead to help raise revenue for those services. So to reiterate why I'm framing this in terms of misdemeanors, over 97% of all crimes or violations filed in Delaware in 2019. And I'll tell you, I just need to update this, but it's the same for 2020 and 2021. Over 97% of all of them were misdemeanors. This is straight from the courts put out records every year, annual reports of how many types of charges are filed. And so this is just straight from that, just a straight calculation of the numbers that the courts themselves put out. In addition, there was a national study done by an academic who I think at the time that I found this, she was at Chicago, and now she's at like Yale or Harvard. But Delaware actually has the highest per capita arrest rate for misdemeanors in the country. So fines and fees are an issue in pretty much every jurisdiction around the country, but Delaware is actually unique in that we have such an expansive criminal justice system. So the reason that these fines and fees matter, obviously, we heard Hanif's stories. There are so many stories like his, unfortunately. But to put it in stats, almost 40% of Americans can't afford an unexpected $400 expense. So the US Federal Reserve does these annual reports, and they found that 27% of folks would have to borrow or sell something to pay an unexpected $400 expense, and 12% would be simply unable to pay it at all. And that's of all Americans. But actually Delaware has a slightly higher poverty rate than the national average. So we're talking about something that's likely even worse in Delaware. So what happens when people can't pay? We already heard a couple ramifications, but their driver's licenses are suspended. They're issued arrest warrants, and they go to prison. To add some stats, just in the first 6 months of 2018, there were 129 people incarcerated purely for failing to pay Delaware court-ordered fines and fees. To put in perspective some of the license suspension things we're talking about, in 2017, over 20,000 driver's licenses were suspended for failure to pay court-ordered fines and fees, and there were over 40,000 warrants for failure to pay just for non-felony offenses. So, for a state of under 1 million people, we are talking about a substantial percentage of the population that's impacted by this system. And overall, this creates a two-tiered justice system. So for someone with means, if they're convicted of a misdemeanor in the exact state, in that exact example that I gave, they're going to pay the $502 on the day of conviction or shortly thereafter. They're going to serve probation, typically for 1 year, but if it's a low-level probation, they might even be put on non-reporting probation. And so it's not even going to feel like a full year, or they might be discharged early. And then, thank you to the work of the ACLU and other groups like it. After 5 years, assuming they finished with probation and didn't have any new convictions, most misdemeanors are eligible for expungement now. And soon that will even be an automatic process. So if someone served their probation and they paid off their fines and fees, after 5 years, they won't even have a record from this. But what happens if someone doesn't have the money to do that? So they're put on a payment plan on the day of their sentencing. There's no statutory requirement for courts in Delaware to give payment plans. So all of them function in a kind of an ad hoc process. I've even found in the same court from day to day, I've had clients put on different payment plans or different payment plan processes, even in front of the same judicial officer. It's not consistent, but typically we're talking about $20 or $30 a month. Again, to put that in perspective, at $20 a month, assuming someone misses no payments, for that $502 in court costs, we're talking about 26 months for someone to pay off that debt. And then just like someone who had means, they would serve a year of probation if they had no violations. If they fail to make a monthly payment, they're issued an arrest warrant and they're charged a capias fee on top of any outstanding debt. A capias is a bench warrant. So that's just a fee for getting a warrant. Some courts give warning before you're given the warrant. Some courts don't. Even when warning is given, it's usually something that you receive in writing in the mail. And so if you're someone who's had housing insecurity, or someone who's even just living in a shared housing environment, if you miss that written notice, that's it. You then get the warrant. And for a lot of folks, they find out that they had a warrant when they're subsequently arrested. So at the same time the warrant is issued, the court notifies DMV and the person's driver's license is suspended indefinitely until they make a payment to the court and also pay a reinstatement fee to the DMV at $50. Like I mentioned, a lot of people have no idea that their license was suspended or that a warrant was issued until something happens. So here's the something happens. If they're pulled over for a minor traffic violation, it's often then that someone finds out their license is suspended when the officer runs their license. And then here's a worse example. If they get into a car accident, often when their license is suspended for failure to pay, they also have their car insurance revoked. There's usually not notice of that. And so I've literally had this happen where clients get into a car accident, like we all do as human beings, have accidents from time to time. And they find out at the accident that not only was their license revoked, but they're actually an uninsured motor vehicle driver and they have no idea. And so what should be a minor mistake turns into a very big ordeal. So when they find out their license is suspended, they'll be arrested for driving on a suspended license. The typical outcome for that is a plea to no valid license, which is a slight downgrade. It's a $50 fine. With court costs, it's $252. There's no possibility of jail time the first time that someone gets that, but if they get a subsequent offense, jail is on the line just as a sentence for that offense. And I'll tell you all that I've definitely seen people serve jail time on this offense where the only reason their license was originally suspended was failure to pay. And then here's the big thing. When people find out their license is suspended, they can no longer drive to work legally. They either lose their job, they incur further costs, and they're faced with a really impossible choice. Even if they're not working, it's just a reality of living in most places in the United States, but certainly in Delaware, that public transportation is difficult and unreliable. I had a client one time who she picked up a number of these driving on a suspended license cases because she had missed a payment on a minor offense. It was a very minor offense. And she knew her license was suspended, but she had a young child who had been diagnosed with leukemia. And so she picked up somewhere between 5 or 7 of these driving on a suspended license cases over the course of 2 years because she was driving her son to Nemours for his chemo treatment. And she came into court and became my client when he went into remission. And she wanted to be able to get her license straight and get her life back in order now that her son was healthy. And so those are the kind of choices that people are making. And she ended up having to pay a fee and take one of these no valid license charges. All because she didn't have money to begin with, and then she was driving her son to chemo. And then this is the big thing. People are even potentially held in prison through this system. So Hanif mentioned that his friend Dee had prison time for court-related costs. Where I've seen it a lot of times is people are held in lieu of bail, where the bail is the amount of money they owe on the outstanding misdemeanor conviction. And again, just to put this in perspective of how absurd this is, obviously there's a human cruelty aspect to incarcerating people like this. There's also just it doesn't make any logical or financial sense aspect of it. It costs the state in the ballpark of $125 a day to incarcerate someone. And for most people that are held, we're talking about small amounts of money for how much they're owing. So to wrap that up, it goes on. If someone had all these things happen, they get that driving charge, it counts as a violation of probation that they had a new arrest while they were on probation. That can result in more jail time. It can result in harder probation, longer probation. Every violation of probation, generally in Delaware, if you are violated, even if you're resentenced to probation, it's another year from whenever that violation was. And so people can have years and years of probation just from these types of violations when someone who had the money to pay it off would have been done within a year. And then, at the end of the day, someone who falls into this trap, could have years or maybe even never be able to pay off their fines, never get their license back. And then the single indiscretion that resulted in a misdemeanor conviction is something that haunts them for the rest of their life, for years, for decades, versus someone who had the means has already long since moved on. And so in short, someone who's convicted of a misdemeanor generally, not always, might get a reasonable sentence that they deal with and they move on from. And then someone who doesn't have means, someone who's poor, is getting a life sentence. If anyone's interested, I just have some more resources on these slides that I'm happy to share with participants afterwards. There's links to read more about this. But in general, that's what I see in my practice, and in talking with clients. It's just this system that it's really self-perpetuating, and it's illogical, and it's very hurtful to folks.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that amazing presentation. I think, one is just to thank you for the work that you do in the community to help others. We need more people like you. And the other is, thank you for sharing that slide presentation, because at least it's been my experience that we only know what we know and what we've experienced in life often. And if you've never experienced anything like this, you really may not know what another person's life is, or what their story is, or what their reality is. And as citizens and as community, I think that, we need to care. And so I really appreciate everything that you just shared with us. Our next really important, amazing speaker is Representative Sean Lynn. Sean is a native to Dover. He graduated from Dover High School and continues to reside in Dover. Sean was a public school teacher in the Bronx in New York for several years after graduating college, where he served in an economically depressed school. During law school, Representative Lynn clerked at the Manhattan law firm of Fazzulo, Shalley, and DiMaggio, located near the former World Trade Center. With the Delaware Family Court, Sean served as counsel for indigent parents involved in litigation with the Division of Family Services through a contract with the state of Delaware in 2006. Active and involved in the community, he has volunteered in many local organizations, including the Children's Theater, the Kent County SPCA, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Northern Kent County Circle of Hope, and Interfaith Ministries. Currently, Sean manages the Patrick H. Lynn Scholarship Funds, a charitable trust established to benefit college-bound local students with financial assistance. Sean also serves as pro bono counsel for several local children through the volunteer work he does through the Office of the Child Advocate. In 2008, he was a candidate for Kent County Levy Court. Sean is a graduate of Pace Law School in White Plains, New York, and a graduate of Marymount Manhattan College in New York City. He was admitted to the Delaware Bar in 2005, and it's a great honor to introduce him to all of you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sean. I'm here to just talk briefly about HB 244. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize the contributions of several people who were integral to this bill. As you can imagine, Miriam Dede, who just presented for us, was one of those individuals who was instrumental in both the drafting and passage of HB 244. I'd also note the contributions of Lynn Keelhorn, the campaign to end debtors prison, the Office of Defense Services and John Alfredo and Lisa Minutola, and then also Mark Catrona, who is one of our drafting attorneys from the Division of Research. I came into this bill rather late in the process, and obviously depended, really depended upon those individuals whose work went before me in presenting this bill to the General Assembly and ultimately getting it passed out of the House. That being said, it's hard to follow Ms. Dede, whose presentation, which I think was fairly comprehensive, and really distills down to these points, and that's the current system of court fines and fees creates unintended consequences with the objectives of our criminal justice system. The reforms in HB 244 will have a positive impact on many Delawareans who now suffer significant and escalating collateral damage if and when poverty prevents them from making payment on court debt. I'd just like to go over HB 244 and what it does and some of the key aspects of the bill. And as many of the other speakers have mentioned, it addresses driver's license suspension. So suspending a person's driver's license because of payment issues around court fees really, if you think about it, makes little to no sense. If the crime or misdemeanor is not related to a driving violation, many people struggle to find or keep a job, making it even harder to pay the mounting court costs, let alone support themselves and their families without a driver's license. And really what this does is it creates a vicious spiral of compounded poverty, which can lead to subsequent arrests and really more jail time. What hasn't been touched on, but I think is really important, is that many people aren't aware that fines and fees can also be imposed upon children. So HB 244 provides that fines and fees cannot be imposed upon children who, as you can imagine, likely have little or no ability to pay those fines or fees. One of the other issues that we're struggling with is really the limited information that we have about the effect of fines and fees. And this bill establishes a path on reporting on the imposition of fines and fees and how they're dispersed. This will lead to transparency in the future in a way to allow for rational review and future reform, which I hope to come once we kind of get our hands on data that surrounds the fines and fees issue. One issue that causes some consternation about fines and fees is some budgeting requirements, wherein historically what we've done is tied fines and fees to certain EMS, police, ambulance, fire services. As you can imagine, this was a hurdle in getting this bill passed, which is why we introduced House Amendment 1, which was written to address concerns about the bill's impact on EMS services and other critical public safety needs. The amendment does this by removing the language from HB 244 that would have given the court the discretion to waive certain fines and fees and court costs, like the ones associated with the Volunteer Ambulance Company Fund. All told, I think that this is a first step. So while I think that we can all be proud of the work that we've collectively done with HB 244, what I also can, attest to is that this is the first step in many to really address a larger kind of overarching issue. And this is our first salvo in attacking what I think is an important issue to really, and again, as the advocates would say, end debtor's prison. So while I'm proud of this work, what I also want to stress is that this is but the first step. And you're going to see us back again, hopefully the same team, Miriam, Lynn, the Campaign to End Debtor's Prison, the Office of Defense Services, and myself to address these issues moving forward. And I hope that I can count on the support of all those individuals kind of participating today, that we need your help moving forward, because while 244 is progress, it's not the end of our collective journey. With that, I'm here for the balance of the call and can answer any questions when we move into that phase of our presentation. But thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Representative Lynn, for all that you're doing. I think, it takes a leader who has foresight to take that first step. And so we appreciate that you've been willing to champion that step, and that you recognize that there are a number of steps still in the future. So we really appreciate the work we at the League, I'm sure the ACLU and other organizations appreciate the work that you are engaged in. And with that, I'm going to introduce our final speaker of the afternoon, Deputy Attorney General Allison Abbasino, who is Deputy Attorney General for the Delaware Department of Justice, supervising the Community Engagement Unit. She currently a unit that supports and uplifts communities statewide and works to build trust between those communities and local law enforcement agencies. Prior to her time in the Community Engagement Unit, Allison served as an assistant supervisor in the City of Wilmington Felony Trial Unit. Since beginning her career with the Delaware Department of Justice in 2012, Allison has prosecuted a wide variety of cases ranging from traffic violations to homicides. Allison graduated from the University of Maryland College Park with a bachelor's degree in English literature and a minor in Spanish languages in 2008, before graduating from Widener University School of Law in 2011. And with that, I am very happy to welcome Allison here today.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank everybody who's done so much work on all of this. Representative Sean Lynn, the ACLU, Miriam, your work with Campaign to End Debtors Prison, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me here today to speak on behalf of the Department of Justice and Attorney General Jennings. This bill was one of the 2021 legislative priorities for AG Jennings. It's very close to her heart, and she is pleased would be the understatement of the year to say she is pleased that this is gaining steam and so much support, because to many it's a no-brainer. It's something that shouldn't have taken us to 2022 to make this happen. My own personal experience as a prosecutor, I realize I'm coming at this from a different angle. But when you start out as a prosecutor, you start out in the Court of Common Pleas, prosecuting, like Miriam said, misdemeanors, traffic cases, things like that. And I was stunned within the first few weeks of starting that work, because I would come across pro se defendants, people who were not represented by an attorney. And we would discuss the case that they had, whether it was, a minor nonviolent misdemeanor or a traffic offense. And I would try to cut someone a break. That was the intention. And you know what? You're only going to pay a $25 fine. That seems fair considering the circumstances. Would you like to take that plea? Yes, I would. Again, the intention of cutting this person a break. The person would then go up in front of the judge, take this plea, and the judge would explain, you're adjudged guilty of this offense. You are to pay the $25 fine. And also you're to pay the associated court costs and fees. And then it felt like they rattled off a 1-minute speech of all of the additional payments that this person now owed on top of that measly $25 fine, where you were trying to help the person out, cut them a break. This is just an endless cycle, as everyone who has spoken before me has talked about. People cannot get out. If you have the means to, that's one thing, but that's not everybody's circumstance. That's not a lot of people's circumstance. And I realize that maybe people have a perception of what the Attorney General's office does, but there is a real push from Attorney General Jennings to provide support for people. The work that the Community Engagement Unit does, we sort of think of ourselves as expanding this idea of prosecution to include not just the time from when a person is arrested to when their case is over and they're sentenced, but there's a period of time before that where the Attorney General's office can offer supports and resources to prevent people from entering the system. If they enter the system and they're coming out of it, if they're re-entering society, if their case is ending, they owe fines, they're on probation, it's also on the Attorney General's office to offer and provide support so that they can be successful in re-entering society, completing their probation, paying off those fines. And what Hanif mentioned was this cycle of recidivism. People with the best of intentions who are working so hard to dig out of this hole, and they can't do it because we have just saddled them with these financial obligations on top of everything else that's going on in their lives. So the Attorney General's office, supporting people's success, that is something that leads to safer communities. And the overall goal of safer communities, that's what all law enforcement wants. And that's what all communities want as well. And so any way that the Attorney General's office can support legislation that eliminates these financial barriers that are eroding the justice in our state, Attorney General Jennings and the office as a whole, that is something we are in support of. And we're just so happy to be here and so proud to be a part of this very esteemed group. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Deputy Attorney General Abisinio, for adding to the conversation. And I want to take the rest of the time that we have to make sure that we're able to share some of the questions so that you guys can have a chance to respond. The first question I'm going to pose to the panel, and the way this will work is I'm just going to pose the question, and whoever is moved, if more than one person is moved to respond, great. To respond, that is awesome. So the first question is this: is poverty treated as a crime when a poor person can't pay the penalty?
I'm happy to answer first. In my opinion, yes. First off, I think really any crime where the penalty is a fine, but there's no investigation into how much someone has in terms of money and how much they're able to pay, is incorporating poverty into a part of the punishment. If Bezos has a speeding ticket, he gets the same fine as someone who's homeless. And that is not fair. Not only would an ideal justice system have no fees, but it would have fines that are tailored so that it's the same impact on someone with a lot of money or a moderate amount of money or no money. And so until we have a system like that, poverty is absolutely an element in penalty. And in fact, the way that our system currently has KPSs, those bench warrants for failure to pay, that's explicitly saying that there should be an arrest warrant out for someone purely because they don't have money.
Thank you, Miriam.
I agree 100% with Miriam. What we have learned, what we're learning is that Delawareans are being jailed for fines and fees. In 2017 alone, the state of Delaware issued 44,000 warrants solely for non-payment of court costs. almost 60% of those 44,000 warrants were issued to people of color. What we've learned is that in the first half of 2018, Delaware sentenced 129 people to jail solely because they couldn't pay court costs. So when we talk about poverty being treated as a crime, well, I think that, therein lies the answer. 129 people just in the first half of 2018 alone, sentenced to incarceration merely because they couldn't pay their court costs. Yeah, I think that does criminalize poverty.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Representative Lynn. And I know Hanif put in the chat. Yes, anytime a person is incarcerated for not having the money to pay a ticket for riding a bike at night, I think that also, kind of says it all right there, riding a bike at night. I am going to move on to another question. Does the system, that we're wondering, does the system sometimes result in punishment when there has been no underlying crime? That was a question that somebody out in the universe posed. Does the system sometimes result in punishment when there has been... Yeah, go ahead, Hanif.
Yeah, I would say yes. And I would just say that the communities that I communicate and are connected to, that's the reason why we call it the system, right? It's not just the system because it's a process to hold people accountable. It's the system because we have the impression oftentimes, just for being Black or just from living in an impoverished community, the system has a way of capturing you into the system, and then you are stuck in the cycle of poverty, recidivism, and crime once you're caught up in the system. And that's why we call it the system. Right? It's not specifically the legal system, the education system, it's the system, which is short for systematic oppression.
Yeah. Thank you, Hanif. Very important point. Very important point. I want to move on to the next question, which is, how much discretion do judges truly have regarding fines and fees, and do they utilize any of the flexibility that they may have?
Miriam, correct me if I'm wrong, but do judges have total discretion over waiving the fines and fees?
No. So for a lot of so some crimes have mandatory minimum fines, in which case it's explicit that the judges have no discretion over the fine element. But for the fees, most of them, there's no legislative discretion. They were created by the legislature, and the judges have no discretion for most of them. In practice, I've seen judges excuse fees that legally they don't actually have the discretion to waive. Certainly not something I've ever brought up and questioned when judges do that. Sometimes judges do waive fines and fees even where they don't technically have the discretion to do so. They do have discretion after someone has been sentenced. If they come in and ask for relief before a KPS or after a KPS has been issued, the courts have discretion at that time. But at the time of sentencing legally, in most cases, they do not. That's something that I think Sean had touched on a little bit, that we had wanted something along those lines in HB 244. We're hoping for future reforms so that we can tackle that issue, because it's one of those things, again, like we've talked so much about how illogical this system is. It's cruel. It's obviously a cruel system, but also it's a system where a lot of the, even in judicial officers that I've spoken to, they don't like it either. they don't like doing this to people either, and they don't have discretion at the time of sentencing to not do it.
And we had made efforts, as Miriam, alluded to. There were efforts made to give the court the discretion to waive fines, fees, and court costs. However, those efforts failed for a variety of reasons. I think from a political standpoint, as I mentioned during my comments, some of those fines, fees, and court costs were related to law enforcement funds or volunteer ambulance funds or firefighter funds, which is really something that should never have happened to begin with, where we're kind of connecting court costs to some of these entities. That should be things that we budget for in the general fund. But they're here, and now to kind of readdress them or reapportion this funding, I think is going to be difficult. So we received significant resistance about language that would give the court discretion to waive those fines, fees, and court costs. I think that's where we're going to have to come back, and that's going to be an issue that we address, next year and in the years to follow. Is how do we give the court that type of discretion? How do we look at ability to pay? These types of things. So again, there's more work to be done, and I think that's kind of the exact point where our next efforts will be directed.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Lynn. And I see that Marjorie has her hand raised, so I'm going to go to Marjorie. Marjorie, you need to unmute.
Yes, I do. Yes. One of the questions that came in not only spoke to the excellent presentations, but wanted to know how Delaware compares with other states on this issue. And I have read that that there has been a study of best practices by Fordham Law School that ranked Delaware 47th of all US states. And my question to the panel is, how do we improve this situation politically and in the courts?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent question. So the study that you're referring to was done by the National Center for Access to Justice at Fordham Law School. And if HB 244 passes, what we believe will happen is Delaware will move up the ranks to number 17. So only Wyoming, Alabama, Arkansas, and Kansas were behind us. If we pass HB 244 successfully, we should be in 17th place, which again, I don't think 17th place is a number that we should aspire to. It's a heck of a lot better
than 47.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But still, we want to be, and I think it's the effort of many of the people on this call, we want to be in the forefront of this. And I think that we're uniquely poised to be in the forefront of a lot of criminal justice reform issues because we have such a small state with a ideologically aligned, General Assembly. So, my hope is, let's take 17 as a starting point and go from there.
And actually, just a little bit to add with that. So the Policy Institute that came up with these numbers. 17th is actually, it's where we would be without the amendment. I know we had when they first told us 17th, I think we'd said 17th really excitedly, but we'll be 28th with HB 244 as written. But I think that really speaks to how much work we have to do and where we need to go. 28th as written, and then hopefully with next steps, we'll get to 17th, and then hopefully with next steps, we'll get to number 1, right? But definitely compared to other states, Delaware is really behind on this issue.
And I know we pressed for time, but I just wanted to add, because they said what could be done, right? And in my opinion, I'm a big fan of HB 244. But what could be done that I think we haven't started on too is we have to address the fact that when it comes to this fees culture, it is adding to like money in the stash, so to speak, if you understand what I'm saying. We already heard in Marion's presentation, some of the fees are not even allocated to the name that it is being charged for the individual. So we are just piling money up for Delaware, which would be great if we were providing resources. So not only are we imprisoning people for being in poverty, but then for the money that we are charging and collecting in some cases, we are not even attempting to put that towards resources for this same impoverished individuals to even try to rehabilitate them or correct them of their actions. So this whole narrative, because once it's so hard to get the fees off the table, because it's like, oh, you're taking money off the EMT plate. Oh, you're taking money off of the public defender's plate, when that is not a true narrative. In essence, they're just stashing money and they never have the resources to kick out to the impacted communities that these fines and fees affect the most. So we can start by just eliminating the fees and stop the narrative that the system would be hurt if they didn't have these fees.
Thank you, Hanif. And this is actually scheduled to end at 1:15. I just want to state that. And I know, Marjorie, I see another question in the chat. Did you want to present that question?
Yes. One of the questions has been the repurposing of police towards fee enforcement diverts significant resources away from traditional police functions, including clearance, solving violent crimes. If it weren't diverted in this way, could the trust between police and the community it serves be enhanced? Is there a factor there?
I think definitely. Sorry.
Yes.
I've spoken to a lot of clients where they're afraid to come into court. I've even spoken to clients where they're victims of crimes themselves and they're afraid to go to the police because they have warrants for failure to pay, or they're even just afraid that they have warrants for failure to pay and they don't know. Anytime that we're giving people arrest warrants and incorporating the police into their daily lives and it isn't necessary and they haven't done anything that's actually wrong, we're eroding that trust in the system.
Yes, thank you.
I agree.
I was going to say, honestly, it may be more about training than it is time allocation. Because honestly speaking, officers can be in the correct area to be addressing violent crimes and more serious issues. But I think most officers are trained when they come in contact people to run their name to make sure it's clean. That's the language I'm familiar with, right? So that time you're taking for individuals who may just be hanging out, having small talk to run their name. And then now if two of them have a bench warrant, you're actually going to transport them down to the police station. You know, that may take up the time, but just the training that, you know, you should be looking for clues to solve serious crimes as opposed to looking for individuals that have a warrant.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Miriam. That's a very good point. Someone put in the chat, Marge Johnson, you know, what's going on in the Senate? Is there, you know, is there going to be a holdup there? What do we need to be concerned about? What do we need to be advocating for?
So, you know, our hope genuinely is that this gets on a House Judiciary agenda, passes, and then gets to the Senate floor promptly. I'd like to think that we did a good job in the House clearing obstacles with some of the entities that may oppose this bill. And we had a pretty significant vote count in getting this out of the House with some bipartisan support. So my hope is that we see that repeated on the Senate side and that it happens quickly.
Yeah,
Before the
thanks.
session ends?
That would be my hope, is that it gets out before this session ends, because if it doesn't, we got to start all over again.
No.
So, I trust that Senator Brown is working on it and we'll get it moving.
Yeah, thank you. And a point that Hanif also wrote in the chat, hopefully with the help of Senator Brown, would be great. We're all hoping. In a Forbes article that was written in 2021, the legal and policy director of the National Center for Access to Justice calls fines and fees the ugly underbelly of the justice system, because state and local governments saddle the most marginalized people in our society with punishment they can't afford. And so my my question in thinking about that and thinking about the citizens in our state is, how can, the average individual like myself, anybody on the call, beyond supporting bills, how can we actively be involved in helping individuals so that, they don't end up cycling back into something, for $20?
Yeah, I think that the first way is, on a macro level with your vote. So, I know that we certainly need all the help we can get here in Kent County to elect individuals that share this philosophy and share this ideology about criminal justice reform. We're losing Andrea Bennett this session. She will be retiring. With that, I think that we lose one of our supporters. So please take a look at Kent County and don't forget about us. And then Sussex County. There is not a sitting Democrat between Andrea Bennett and Pete Schwarzkopf, all the way down in Rehoboth Beach, which means that, criminal justice reform almost entirely rests upon the shoulders of, the Newcastle County contingent. So average people, the first thing you can do is get out there and volunteer for people that believe in criminal justice reform. And, please don't forget about us in Kent and Sussex County, because, we need the help. Other than that, I think that there are charitable organizations out there that can help, individuals who need this type of support and assistance get some of these minor fees and costs paid. And it's just kind of linking people with those types of resources.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to put just real quick, I'm going to put the link in the chat, but there is a fines and fees fund in Delaware. It's the campaign that I work with, the Campaign to End Debtors Prison, started it in conjunction with Friendship House, a really great nonprofit. Just giving a plug for them. I'll put the link in the chat. If anyone knows anyone that needs help with fines and fees, obviously we're talking about these like long-term, let's fix the process, but people are suffering from this right now. And so this is a fund to help people right now. And so if you know anyone that is burdened with debt like this, they can get help. And also if you're looking to make a donation, those are also welcome.
And
Thank
just
you, Miriam.
other ways that come to mind for me is one, if I'm not mistaken, the Superior Court has a community court program, which its focus is geared around providing community supports. I don't know that it often has the capacity to reach out and support individuals, but if fines and fees and provide resources is a specific interest, I'm sure they will be willing to be open and working with you and taking ideas. And other ways is you can also direct connectly with reentry service providers who often are serving a majority population that have outstanding fines and fees. And a lot of times they have fees that are a challenge with getting a driver's license that federal grants or typical nonprofit grants may not be able to cover. So, up and down the state, you have the Delaware Center for Justice, you have the Hope Commission in Newcastle County, and you have other credible nonprofit of reentry service providers that you can connect with directly to help eliminate their population's fines and fee challenges.
That's great. Thank you all very much for all of that important information. And before I close out, I want to turn to Marjorie one more time to make sure I have not missed a question that might be sitting in the chat.
No, you haven't, Laurie. I think our panelists have raised so many of the questions that the audience was concerned with, and a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Marjorie, if I may, I also just want to thank you and your organization as well. I always look forward to seeing members from your organization come to the House Judiciary Committee and kind of weigh in with the position of the League of Women Voters. And we are listening. And you are powerful advocates, and that should not be understated. So thank you for everything that you do and your organization, because you're making a difference as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And Laurie, of course, is intimately involved in all of this. Thank you.
So I want to, on behalf of the League of Women Voters Delaware, the ACLU, the Campaign for Debtors Prison, our committee, the Criminal Justice Portfolio of the League, thank wholeheartedly all of the wonderful panelists today, Representative Sean Lynn, Deputy Attorney General Abisinio, Hanif Salam, and Miriam Dede for an amazing, educational, and I think very inspirational, and giving us so many wonderful ideas about how we can actively get involved with helping to move the scourge, I'm going to call it, of fines and fees, to a place where it no longer affects individuals, particularly those who are in marginalized and difficult places in their lives. So thank you all so very much. Thanks to all our participants. This recording will be up on our website. And so it will be able to be seen by those who weren't able to make it today. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you all very, very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of